Our reading from the Gospel today comes from the 14th chapter of Matthew, beginning at verse 13. It can be found on page 15 of the New Testament in the Pew Bibles. Let us listen for God's Word. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, and he blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. They took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, beside women and children. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our Lord stands forever. Amen. Our reading starts out by saying, when Jesus heard this. Really, it's when Jesus heard the news of John the Baptist's death. He withdrew. He got into a boat and went to a deserted place. When Jesus heard how Herod at his birthday feast granted the wish of a girl who had danced for him, when Jesus heard that this girl's wish was really prompted by her mother, who disliked John because John said that she should not have an affair with Herod because she was married to his brother Philip. When Jesus heard about how Herod said he would give this girl whatever she asked, and she asked for John the Baptist's head on a platter, and that Herod, not wanting to look weak, had John beheaded. When Jesus heard this news of how his friend and cousin had died, he had to get away to a quiet place. So Jesus got into a boat and went away to a deserted place. Maybe he needed to grieve. Maybe he needed to be alone with God in prayer. Maybe he needed to figure out his response to this awful deed. He just wanted to be alone. But when the crowds heard of it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When the crowds heard of John's death, they too had to get away. Maybe they were frightened of Herod, and who could blame them? Maybe they were grieving too. Maybe they were hopping mad and were looking to Jesus as their leader to do something. So they followed Jesus to a quiet place. And Jesus, who had just lost his friend, who was dealing with his own sorrow and grief, Jesus does not ask them to leave him alone. Jesus, who must have in the back of his mind, he must have been thinking that now that they have killed John, that he would be next. Jesus, who, as one commentator mentioned, could have led a revolt against Herod with this crowd, which was what Herod feared in the first place. What did Jesus do? Did he rally the crowd to action against Herod and the Roman government? Did he lead a revolt? No. But what Jesus did do next is revolutionary. Jesus got out of the boat, and he went ashore, and when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for the people who followed him to a quiet place. And so begins this part of the revolution. Jesus began to heal them of their diseases. And as the night progresses, the disciples, who must have caught up with their teacher, the disciples urged Jesus to send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding villages and buy food for the evening. And that sounded reasonable, but it's not revolutionary, at least not to Jesus. So Jesus tells the disciples, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. They need not go away, Jesus says. I can understand why the disciples suggest sending the crowds on their way. Maybe they were looking out for their teacher, trying to provide some space for him to grieve, trying to help him rest in a quiet place. Maybe they're looking out for themselves. Maybe they were too tired, and maybe they were grieving too and needed some time away. Maybe they were concerned for the people who had been there all day and were worried that they needed some nourishment. But in contrast to the divide and conquer mentality of the empire, Jesus says they need not go away. We need to stick together. In contrast to the I'll take care of me and mine attitude cultivated by Rome, Jesus says they need not go away. We are all in this together, and we will take care of one another. And that was revolutionary. They need not go away. And that was not the only thing that was revolutionary that Jesus said. Because he went on to say, you give them something to eat. And the disciples replied kind of matter-of-factly, well, we've got nothing here but 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Basically, they said, we've got nothing. And instead of saying to the disciples, you're right, you got nothing. Just 5 loaves, 2 measly fish. Jesus says, bring them here to me. Then he orders the crowd to sit down on the grass, and he takes what the disciples have. And then he takes the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he blesses what they have given them. And then he gave them back to them. And the disciples gave what they had to the crowds. And Matthew tells us that all ate and were filled, 5,000 men, plus women and children. And not only that, there were 12 baskets of leftovers, 1 for each of the disciples. Jesus took what nothing the disciples had and turned it into an abundant feast, where everyone ate and were filled. And is it possible that as the crowd saw the disciples giving what they had, they were inspired to offer what they had with them? I don't know, but it's something to consider. That when the disciples share what they have been given, it helps others share what they have been given too. But what I do know is that in the end, the disciples got back more than they gave. In contrast to Herod, who threw a hedonistic party in his own honor, where gluttony and greed and arrogance were at the center of the feast, Jesus presides over a feast where sharing and abundance come from humility. In contrast to Herod, whose guest list was exclusive, Jesus welcomed all to the banquet. In contrast to Herod, whose feast led to suffering and death, Jesus hosts a feast that leads to all being fed by the bread of life. And that was revolutionary. You give them something to eat. Jesus said they need not go away. The disciples in this story stand in for each and every disciple that has come and will come after them. You see, when we are weighed down by the cares of our own lives and the life of the world and want to retreat to our own quiet place, Jesus says to us, they need not go away. In contrast to the divide and conquer mentality of our own world, Jesus says they need not go away. We need to stick together. In contrast to the I'll take care of me and mine attitude cultivated by our society, Jesus says they need not go away. We are in this together, and we will take care of each other. And that is still revolutionary. They need not go away. You give them something to eat. Inasmuch as on any given day we stand in the shoes of those first disciples, these words are spoken to us. In contrast to the powerful of our day, where gluttony and greed and arrogance are at the center of the feast, Jesus still presides over a feast where sharing and abundance come from a place of humility. In contrast to the rulers of our time whose guest list is exclusive, Jesus still welcomes all to the banquet. In contrast to nations whose feasts lead to suffering and death, Jesus still hosts a feast that leads all to being fed by the bread of life. And that, my friends, is still revolutionary. You give them something to eat. On the days when we see the need in the world and we think we got nothing, Jesus says to us, bring what you have to me. And then, like he did with the first bit of nothing those first disciples had, 5 loaves and 2 fish, he takes it and he blesses it, and then he gives it back to us so that we may give it to the crowds who are in front of us. And in the end, we will get back more than we gave. Liz Barrington Forney says that it's not that we don't have the resources to feed the masses. She says we are limited by our forgetfulness. She writes, our primary limitation is not lack of resources, but our amnesia, our forgetting to offer up what has been given to the one whose desire it is to bless us. It's true that the disciples had something to give, even if they thought it was a meager offering. And it's true that each of us and all of us have something to offer those who hunger and those who hunger and thirst for righteousness in this world. Sometimes we forget to offer what we have to Jesus and let him bless what we give so that we can give it to the world. You give them something to eat. That is still revolutionary. Professor Alice Mackenzie writes about remembering as part of what the story helps us to do. She says the story also encourages us to look forward. Right? The story, she says, motivates us to get up out of our comfortable chairs and throw ourselves into offering our resources on behalf of a needy world. It calls us to remember and to anticipate. We are to stand in the story, looking back and looking forward, looking back to the manna in the wilderness and forward to the Lord's Supper. We are to stand looking back, re-experiencing who God has been in the past. And we are to stand looking ahead with faith in who God will be and what God will do in the future. You see, remembering God, who God has been, helps us offer what we have because we know the stories of our ancestors of the faith and even the stories of our own lives when God has used what we have given to feed hungry people. And that remembering helps us to have faith in the future where God will continue to host a feast where all are welcome and the bread that is offered is the bread of life. They need not go away. You give them something to eat. We are in this gift called life together. We are called together to care for one another and those whom God puts in front of us. So let us bring what we have to Jesus. He will take what it is that we offer, and he will bless it and us. And then he will give it back to us, so that we may give it to the people in the world or just around the corner who have retreated to a quiet place, who are hurting and grieving and hungry for the bread of life. And in this way, the revolution that Jesus started continues still. Amen.